Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I've got to set it up as you don't see people's faces unless their videos are turned on, I think. But I'm going to remove that. So we can see all of you now. We know who's here. We're a smaller group, smaller group as we go. Nice to see some of you again. It's nice to see many familiar faces. So welcome to this last Fishbowl. I'm going to ask you, turn your cameras if you can, so that it's more of an intimate conversation. And I'm going to let people in as we go. So today we're going to talk about the last principle of the series, which is all about evaluation. So dynamic evaluation. We've discussed justification, optimal scale, coordination, and now it's the turn for dynamic evaluation. And possibly this is the most challenging one. We have two guiding questions. How have you incorporated dynamic evaluation into scaling processes? And what have been the challenges and opportunities you faced? And also, have you used results of dynamic evaluation to inform an approach to scaling impact? And if so, how? And if not, what inhibited it? So a couple of sort of long questions for us to discuss. We're going to follow the same format as we did last time. We're going to ask this time Leslie to present the principle of dynamic evaluation, and then I'll just go to the room and ask you to join us. And through the Slack chat, I've already I think I've volunteered Tobias, so I'll go to you afterwards first, and then I know Petronella, you have to leave early, so if you want to say something before you do, I'll also give you a chance. But I invite anybody else to join in as we did last time. I think we had a good conversation last time. So let's get started. We're recording this, and as always, we'll be sharing the video with everybody soon after. Leslie, do you want to get us started with the presentation?
Sure. First, let me share my screen here. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, y'all can see that. Oops. Sorry about that. Oh, hold on, you guys. This isn't working the way I had hoped. Let me just fix this. Whoops. My apologies. I'll get this up and running just a second here. All right, let's try this. All right, if this doesn't work, we will try a different way. Oh, it's so strange. We piloted it before we came online, and of course, now it's not working the way I hoped. All right, let's see what we can do here. Sorry, guys.
No worries, it happens. I was just to me a couple of weeks ago, and I think I jinxed your presentation by commenting on my my own mishap.
That's all right. We'll figure out a way here. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and share with you my PowerPoint in general, and we will go from there. Assuming I can find it. Oh my goodness, I've never had this trouble before. Is it crazy? All right, there we go. All right, and let me get the actual slideshow up here. What are you seeing now?
We see your PowerPoint and notes.
Okay, we don't want to see that. All right. Oh my goodness. Okay. Do you still see PowerPoint?
Yes, you might have to do
Okay.
it
Let
without
me
notes.
just do this. Yep. Oh yeah, I can do it without notes. I just want to make sure that I'm actually sharing something that you can see a little bit better than this, because when I bring it to a presentation, it's not
Okay.
playing well with me here.
right.
Okie doke. There we go. Can you see the slides there?
Perfect.
Good enough? All right. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So as Kike mentioned, we're going to be talking about scaling impact, the fourth principle of this, dynamic evaluation. And so just as a reminder, dynamic evaluation is in fact intended to be quite dynamic, right? The idea is that scaling impact itself is a coordinated effort with the idea of achieving a collection of impacts at optimal scale that is only undertaken if it's both morally justified and warranted by the dynamic evaluation of evidence, right? So it plays a critical role in scaling impact. Dynamic evaluation is listed as the fourth principle, but I think it's really important to keep it in mind that that doesn't mean it comes last in all of this, right? Instead, what dynamic evaluation is really supposed to do, and the intent of it, is to provide insights along the entire continuum of the scaling effort, and to provide insights around the other three principles, right? So as you are looking at justification, as you're looking at optimal scale, as you're looking at coordination, those principles, dynamic evaluation is playing a really important role in helping us to understand how those things are going, right? And how close are we getting to, or what can we do to actually achieve that optimal scale that we're striving to accomplish, right? So as this quote suggests here, dynamic evaluation is a means of continuous learning, right? And that's part of its dynamic nature. The idea is that it's supposed to help innovators gather feedback rapidly, learn through iterations, right? So that we're continually modifying and changing these factors and we're getting feedback about how that's going. And focus on value creation, right? We want to remember that kind of the idea here is that dynamic evaluation is also feeding into this idea of impact for the public good and is contributing to that in a meaningful way. So in similar fishbowls, we want to break down this dynamic evaluation principle a little bit. And so the first thing to keep in mind is that scaling itself is an intervention, right? And so because it is an intervention, it also produces its own effects and it can then be evaluated, right? So it's what we would call an evaluation, an evaluand, right? A really fancy word for what is being evaluated or the subject of evaluation. And so last week, or not last week, but in our last fishbowl, one of the things that I believe came up was the idea that, well, maybe we could be examining what factors play into strong coordination efforts, right? And so those types of questions are fair game here, right? We're asking questions about those other principles and thinking through dynamic evaluation. And those are questions about scaling itself, right? So you can imagine that you can ask questions about the process, you can ask questions about the outcomes, you can ask questions about the impact, and you can answer all of those through this evaluation approach. The other thing that we want to think about is when dynamic evaluation can occur throughout a scaling effort. And when we're talking about something like impact and we're saying we want to scale impact, it's really natural, I think, for us to gravitate towards having evaluation towards the end, right? And really keeping our eye on that. But it is really important to keep in mind that there's this aspect of or characteristic of dynamic evaluation that calls it into play at every time point in a scaling effort, right? So at the beginning of a scaling effort, it can really help us to think through what are some of those potential outcomes, all right? What are some potential impacts that we could have? intended, unintended, right? And we can use some of the tools of the trade to help us think through this. So I think Dina mentioned in the last Fishbowl that maybe there's the potential of doing like a theory of change for a scaling effort. And so that's the kind of thing that you might be thinking about before. Then of course there's during. And so you can be thinking about what we were just talking about on the previous slide, asking questions about the processes or maybe some of the early outcomes as part of this. And then after the scaling effort, we can also think about the impact, right? Of course, recognizing that when we're evaluating and looking at impact, we often needed to have started that process earlier on, at least the data collection aspects of it, right? But we can look at the scaling intervention as a whole and think about the impacts that may have come from it. And then the third thing that we wanted to call into attention, and it may be one of the most important pieces of this, is that dynamic evaluation, it's a stance, it's not a methodology, right? And so there are many evaluation approaches out there, right? Utilization-focused evaluation, theory-driven evaluation. There's all kinds of ways and philosophies and beliefs about how evaluation can be done. But that's not really what we're talking about with dynamic evaluation. It doesn't kind of have a set of prescriptions that drive it, right? It's not an approach per se. And it's also not tied to a specific design. So it's not wedded to something like a randomized controlled trial or a case study design or something like that. What it is it's an idea, right? And the idea is that you have to remain adaptive and flexible, right? In this context, and continuously kind of re-examine the space that you're operating in with the evaluation. So there's a real recognition with dynamic evaluation that the questions that we're answering through the evaluation, they're not going to stay the same, right? As the context is changing, and as kind of the scaling efforts changing, we're going to see different questions arise in the process, and we're going to need to adapt to answer them with the appropriate method at any given time. So last week, or in the last session, John shared this, and it was animated. And unfortunately, given my little problem with my technology here this morning, I can't animate it. But what you saw in this when it was animated, as you might remember, is that these lines, they looked like they were on a linear path, and then they started kind of recursing on each other, and the circles started blending together. And it really, I think, showed at a glance like the very dynamic nature of scaling. And the thing is that when you have an intervention that operates like this, you have to have an evaluation approach that works like this too. And I'll have to say that I don't really know of a specific type of evaluation that's out there today that really responds to this type of scenario. Probably the closest thing that you can get to it is developmental evaluation that Michael Quinn Patton has put forth and used over the years. But I suspect actually that dynamic evaluation still needs to kind of be created in some respects. And that's actually what happened with developmental evaluation as well. So I think that today is going to be a really good set of conversations that's going to help us kind of move on this journey to thinking about what does dynamic evaluation need to look like? What has it perhaps looked like in your context, so that we can kind of go on this journey together in defining what dynamic evaluation might actually be in the future. So here are the questions that were posed for this particular Fishbowl. And I will turn it over to Kike to go ahead and facilitate. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. That was very interesting. There's already a question in the chat by Johannes, I think. What about evaluating aspects beyond impact, whether the vision of optimal scale remains appropriate? Because it might change. What's happening to enabling conditions that support, hinder the scaling process, how partnerships and coordination are working, etc. Let me go to Tobias. As I said, I volunteered for this, and see if, Tobias, you have any reflections on this issue.
Okay, thanks, Enrique. Good afternoon from the University of Cape Town that you see there in the back. The weather is not quite as good in Rio, but at least it's for the first time since March. It's true what I just said, because I'm sitting this week for the first time back in my office. So things are normalizing in a way. It's quite exciting, actually. And it also gives me the kind of space that I actually need to work. I have 2 small children at home, so participating in these fishbowls and all the other things was a bit of a challenge over the last couple of weeks, I suppose, with small people knocking on the door. So yes, you did volunteer me to this. I think like to put the cards on the table fully. You also volunteered me about like 5 or 10 minutes before this call. I think, or 15 minutes. So I take normally the role of being a discussant quite seriously, because I actually think that what a discussant is supposed to do is actually add some additional insight, and also to kind of engage with the presentation that you just heard, that which I just heard, and I'm now trying to connect the dots a little bit. But I guess I'm actually perhaps one of the people in this group that is quite challenged by that final principle, and maybe that is actually in terms of really understanding it, and perhaps just mentioning these kind of is it concerns, or is it lack of understanding or something, will perhaps get our conversation also going into an interesting direction. So I guess as a group, we didn't have like kind of an in-depth conversation prior to today. So I'm inviting the other group members, if they wish to do so, to complement what I'm saying, or correct me if necessary. But I'm sharing you a couple of our thoughts and my thoughts. And the first one is that I have to say that I really had difficulties. Look, I didn't attend the Fishbowl last week, admittedly, but I engaged with it prior, and then the other 2 I attended. And this was all pretty straightforward to me. And this one here, for the first time, I was like, what are we really talking about? And I think part of the problem also, perhaps as a non-native speaker, which many of us here are, is like terms like dynamic already starts to be like, what does that actually really mean? It kind of reminds me of a lesson that far back in school, when I think it was philosophy or something, when actually the teacher kind of told us never use terms that you don't know what they mean, and rather try to be precise. And flexible is one of flexible, perhaps, and dynamic in particular, is one of these terms where I at least need to have a follow-up question. What does that really mean? Now, Leslie, you just referred to also to flexible. Perhaps it is actually in the meaning of flexible, but maybe there's something more to it. So I think we can perhaps digest that a little bit further. The term dynamic generally is something that wasn't at least leading me onto the right kind of path in terms of where I need to look at if it goes beyond flexibility, which I can easily understand. The second problem that I had with this discussion, also from the video that I saw, and also looking at the playbook a little bit more, is that it seems to emphasize things about evaluation, and in fact, like these kind of sisters, monitoring and evaluation, really, that I thought are part of a normal M&E practice anyways, and not only in the context of scaling. And what I mean with that is that it needs to be considered during the planning stage, that it is an ongoing exercise, and that it's a responsive exercise, and then obviously that it also needs to be more nuanced than simply asking whether impact has occurred, but also kind of how has it occurred, and just more granularity on that. And I thought this is something that is part and parcel of a general M&E process anyways. But then I watched the video, and then I had to possibly admit afterwards that perhaps we need to be, in our project, certainly open air, which I put into the brackets, maybe we need to be even a little bit more granular in our evaluation when it comes to impact evaluation before, during, and after our scaling activities. Maybe we need to actually look a little bit closer at this. But I guess by and large, unconscious, unconsciously, we kind of already do whenever we scale these kind of dynamic evaluation or adhere to these dynamic evaluation principles in many ways. And then also towards the end of each project cycle, and our project has been going on for, sorry, someone's trying to call here. And towards the end of each project cycle, and we have been around for about a decade or so, obviously what we found then also informed what we decided to do next. How do we actually take this forward? What kind of path does that lay out what we have experienced over the last couple of years, 2-3 years, and what we have seen in terms of how we now going to scale our activity sideways, depth-wise, or whatever. And then I suppose coming to the issue of a challenge that is part of the question here, I guess that the challenge that I always repeat in different contexts, and it fits here as well, is what we experience in our kind of policy change focus activities. That is the kind of project that we are engaging with. It's this kind of long time that often lies between our activities and then the intended impact. So many times the impact only does happen after the project has long ended. At least that cycle of the project has long ended. So what we have then started to do is actually not to stick slavishly to the kind of M&E processes for the current cycle, but we don't forget about what we did prior, what kind of led to the kind of work that we are doing, and we kind of start to assess and to reflect on the kind of impacts that are actually more closely linked to previous iteration of the project rather than now, because it's now 8 years later, but we are sure that some of the stuff that we did back then is actually now having certain impacts. And I think we would lose something if we were not to report, even in a kind of newish project, onto these kind of impacts as well. So I guess that was my initial kind of thoughts on that. I think it's a little bit more of a pushback in terms of clarification and how is that different to the kind of things that M&E would entail anyways. We have throughout our projects always tried, budget permitting, to get someone on board who knows a lot about M&E. So M&E consultants work very, very well for us, and even if it's in an infrequent basis. But these are the kind of things that they have always told us: don't get us in too late, do it during the project as well. And then at the end, obviously, it's important to also kind of plan of what's coming next. And that's in relation to everything, really, but I guess is then also true to in the context of scaling. So this is my contribution here, but I saw that between more or less the beginning of this call and now, there was additional contributions from team members on our shared Google Doc. I'm not sure whether I can do justice to that by basically just looking at this, but what Amédée, maybe if he wants to add to what I'm just trying to summarize here, basically also spotted was that key statement that dynamic evaluation is not a method but a stance. That basically spoke most to him in our group, and then he said, and I read this out here, that he tried to figure out methods that can be used and laid out potential challenges and opportunities. So Amédée, I'm sorry, this is just too short that I can actually meaningfully speak to that, but I think perhaps that's enough for getting the discussion going further. Enrique, I hope that was what you had in mind more.
Yes, thank you, Tobias. That was very good. I mean, Amédée, do you wanna join in and? Sorry
for putting you on the spot.
No. Would you like to clarify or expand on what Tobias said you wrote?
Clarify. Actually, I'm open to start the conversation, because as Tobias mentioned, it's not it's expected, because we know that the process is dynamic. At the same time, it's a difficult thing to grasp depending on where you stand for. For example, if you, as a scientist, we develop innovation, and we are the one who will implement the innovation or be at the core of the scaling team, then of course we might be able to start the evaluation that we call like a scalability, that is before the implementation and going forward. But if it's another team that developed the innovation and we want to use that innovation and scale it up, then we need to find out who might be the best team to actually do that initial step, that is before the scaling process. And also, when we look at the methodology for us to be able to publish the paper, I mean, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have some control condition, even if it's a real world process, some control condition that you can input the implement intervention to the outcome. So there's an equilibrium to try to find, and I was just thinking about the different kind of approaches that can be used to meet those different expectation from having enough ongoing process of looking at the different aspects of the scaling process, but at the same time be able to, at the end of the process, input the impact to your intervention. So for that, you need at least to be knowledgeable of what we call, I think in previous discussion, as the core components of the innovation that need to be maintained, even if you you are feeding into the process new information based on ongoing evaluation or monitoring. So I put different kind of terminology, but I think other colleagues will reflect on that as action research or participatory research, things like formative evaluation, that is trying to see how things to understand the different components going forward. Some people can talk about monitoring and evaluation. These are concepts that are all around. So I guess Adam will jump in. So maybe I can stop now,
Sure.
and then we can move forward with the discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I think I mean, let me identify a couple of points that I think relate to previous discussions. So one is that the nature of the innovation needs to be taken into account when thinking about the right way of assessing impact, of evaluating the scaling of that innovation. It's not, I think Petronella, you talked about that when we were talking about justification, I think. And then the other point is that it's not always the same people, the same teams involved throughout, right? So there might be different roles played by different type of organizations at the beginning when the innovation is developed or when the pilot is developed, and then the scaling might happen through partnerships or through collaboration with somebody else. And we talked about that last time in the last Fishbowl. But I think Tobias, you were highlighting the issue of so the concept itself. What do we mean specifically by dynamic? I've looked at online sort of constant change, a positive attitude, right? So it's a bit of agency and at the same time is constant changing. And then evaluation. And let me echo something I think you said, Tobias. You talked about this is almost standard, but at the same time, I was thinking, Leslie, when you were presenting, and then I was reading through some of the material. It seemed that it wasn't really about, it seemed to me that the word evaluation was misplaced, and that the word that made more sense was learning. Is that you were asking for, in this spectrum of learning versus accountability, that it was almost everything about learning. It's about learning before, learning during, learning after, because you even use the term estimate the impact, not evaluate the impact. So it's about finding what's the impact, which suggests that there's no expectation of, there's no sense of, if you didn't meet that impact, then you failed. Blanca, you made this comment in the Slack, right? There's a negative attitude towards evaluation because people perceive it as, you're just checking on you, did you do the right thing? But the language you're using is actually everything but that. It's the opposite of that. It's encouraging evaluation for the point of learning, but everything for the point of learning. So I wonder if this really should be about dynamic learning. It's about that's the purpose, and so the methods should be mixed, right? A bit of research, about evaluation, a bit of action research. The options might be broader and more diverse if we talk about dynamic learning. I don't know what reaction that reflection suggests. I don't know who'd like to go and continue the conversation. You don't have to answer my comment. Yes, Blanca, you go ahead.
Yes, many thoughts after Leslie's presentation, and maybe I am biased because I was trained as an evaluator, so I really love the concept of evaluation because it brings us to implementation in some ways. So sometimes learning, words are words at the end of the day, is the way we interpreted them and we value them in our own visions. But let me bring some of the ideas while I was listening to Leslie. The word stance made me think a lot about maybe the important, and also the dynamic aspect of the evaluation that you're bringing up in your discussion. It reminds me a lot of the discussions around building culture in institutions, in organizations, like safety culture, for instance. So maybe what we need to think about is how to build and nourish an evaluation culture, and how to bring the right attitudes, beliefs, priorities in all the members of a project and in all the stakeholders in a project. And that would, in my mind, facilitate the process of evaluation, because everybody has that in their minds. So, and it's something that you have to build intentionally at all levels with all stakeholders. And it brings us to the discussion of what incentives, what communication tools we use to build this culture within our groups. I don't know if this is something that you can relate to, but I was thinking about that. Communication, incentives, and a culture of evaluation rather than a method A, B, or C.
Great, thank you. Which I think it's about the ideas. It's about everybody in the team, every partner, constantly thinking about, are we moving in the right direction? Are we doing the right things? What are we learning? Again, it makes me think about a culture of learning as much as a culture of evaluation.
Yeah. Also, if you understand that thinking about scaling in your own space in a project, if everybody in your team has the same approach and they have scaling as one of the layers that they have to think about, then it's more like if you bring if you design spaces to discuss specifically about that during the project, then you can trigger that from your own resources and your own team, rather than having that like an artificial added aspect in your project. But you need to build intentionally those spaces and those attitudes and that understanding of scaling and the need to evaluate for scaling.
Yeah, and so this connects nicely to something that Petronella wrote in the chat before having to leave, and then I'll go to Haley. And she talked about the fact that, I think this is what she's referring to, if you think about this as a separate thing, Blanca, you're saying this has to be built into everybody's job description in a way. But if you think of this as a separate thing, then the amount of data and effort required might demand resources equivalent to just doing research on itself. So you're almost competing with the core mission of the initiative because of the amount of effort required. And at the same time, it's assuming that, and this is a comment on dynamic evaluation, it's assuming that the effects are visible right away, and therefore you can adapt. You can do an evaluation and then quickly adapt the next stage, right? So that's clearly going to be difficult unless you build it into the job description of every member of that team. So everybody is constantly thinking, what am I learning now, and try to shorten the feedback loop that is going to take place. Haley?
Yeah, a lot of really interesting points raised, but just, I guess, a couple things to pick up on. In part, I guess, first of all, this kind of learning evaluation, what's the right word? I think your comment, Blanca, in the Slack channel last night, and you've sort of spoken to it a little bit here, just about people perceiving evaluation as being an accountability exercise, is a really important thing to keep in mind, because as we're saying, whether we call it evaluation or learning, we're doing this dynamic evaluation or taking this stance for learning purposes, more so than for accountability. So I think that's just a really important consideration to keep in mind as we discuss this. And I think as well, just on this point of like, when can you see the impacts, and to Johannes's point early in the conversation about looking at looking at how we get the right information to allow us to act on some of these other principles of scaling. I think that's a really important focus of this dynamic evaluation principle, as well, as really on the how, and are we collecting the right evidence to allow us to embrace these other principles.
Thank you. Anybody else like to join in? Johannes? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great conversation, first of all. Secondly, if I can come back to my comments, since Haley just referred to it. I think what the dynamic evaluation principle is mostly about, as I read it and listened to it, is about the how and the when rather than the what. In other words, what are we evaluating? What are we trying to learn about? And that's where I thought maybe if we can talk a little bit about what we need to focus on beyond impact, which is what we usually care about, of course, and we should, but also what I would call the enabling conditions that actually allow the scaling process to go forward, and keeping a constant eye on those and learning about whether or not indeed they're falling into place, or whether we're able to remove the barriers. But even the concept of optimal scale, I think, needs to be constantly evaluated, because as we go through the scaling process, we learn stuff that can tell us whether or not our initial sense of optimal scale, in fact, remains appropriate. And finally, of course, as we in the last few Fishbowls talked about a lot about partnerships, coordination, and so on, how is the coordination process, the partnership process actually working? So from my perspective, the evaluation process needs to go far beyond the impact that we tend to focus, and by the way, reinforced by impact evaluation, of course, RCTs and so on, which makes it focus even more on impact, and to some extent exclusively. So that was my thought as I was listening to the dynamic aspect. By the way, dynamic, the word, I think is okay, because the process of scaling, of course, is a continuous change involved. And so from my perspective, also not being a native speaker, Tobias, I think it's an okay term. Let me just put it this way, for me anyway. Over.
So you've got, I'll go to Tatiana in a second, but so you want to evaluate different things, or different whats, right? So you want to evaluate the whole process, but you also want to evaluate each principle, right? And you want to do it at different moments in the process, which all of this is going to require, and Leslie, you're saying this is a stance, not a methodology. And to follow the sort of horses for courses rule, different principles, different moments in the process will require different methods. So potentially you're looking at an evaluation effort that involves different methods, therefore different skills, different types of evaluation tools to collect different types of data, it can be quite it can be quite large thing. It can develop into an intervention of its own, sort of to suggest what Petronella was saying, that the resources required might be quite too broad. So as a way of thinking about this, maybe does it make sense to do dynamic evaluation of a single scaling effort? Or is it much better to make sure that dynamic evaluation happens in partnership, so that you accompany several scaling efforts, so that maybe each one may focus on some parts of that process, and or focus on the same parts but learn together. So just I think to what Johanna said, to assess the enabling conditions, or the conditions that explain why something happens, I guess you need to compare. You need to have other stories to bring into the conversation. So I wonder if, one, in terms of resources, does it make sense to do it all on your own in a single evaluation, in a single scaling process? And two, if you want to learn what works or what doesn't work, does it make sense to do it only in a single scaling effort, or does it make sense to compare? So I leave that there as something before I forget. Tatiana, do you want to follow up? Or Leslie, do you want to come back to something specific? Okay, so Tatiana, you were next.
Yeah, I was thinking about the challenges because when I think about dynamic evaluation, I see it as a collection of evaluation methodologies. And sometimes when you are working on a project or an initiative, and even when you are thinking about the scaling, you have like a limited amount of resources. So you have to prioritize one type of evaluation or other. And in most cases, and I have to say this is not the case of IDRC, donors prefer RCTs and impact evaluations, and sometimes an RCT is by its nature very inflexible. And also, like, my biggest concern is that I am not an economist. I am not in charge of evaluation in my own organization. But what I can see is that there is a difference and a huge gap still between qualitative and quantitative evaluation. Like, those words, sometimes they don't talk and they are not necessarily, sometimes I feel frustrated because I don't see an integrated approach. Like, RCTs are very quantitative, and sometimes I have like more questions that I need to get answers. And when you only focus on one specific methodology, you cannot see like the whole, you cannot see an integrated approach, or you cannot have like a holistic approach. So that's one challenge. And also, like, another concern that I have is sometimes when you are doing pilots, you have certain results, especially like related with impact evaluations. And sometimes, and again, it's not the case of IDRC, but it's the case of one donor that I have right now, is they want that the pilot results are the same as when you are scaling up. And of course, when you are scaling, you are dealing with a different set of conditions. And it's very difficult to make them understand that you are not going to get the same results because you are dealing in a very different context. But it's a pressure you have, especially when you are, for example, working in projects where you are being paid by results or initiatives like that.
Thank you, Tatiana. Leslie?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in about the resources item. I think it's a really important topic to think about. I mean, whether we're thinking about evaluation in kind of the more traditional sense, right? Like, and I think that's I probably should have thrown that into the presentation. I think dynamic evaluation is different than how we traditionally think about evaluation, which is more like, I guess kind of the story goes, you have formative evaluation, you kind of work out the kinks in an early project, and then you move into kind of a summative phase, or like an outcome or an impact evaluation once you have everything kind of sorted out. You feel like you can keep things a little bit consistent, right? But in this case, what you have is constant changing, right? And so how do you address that when you have an evaluation effort? But irrespective of kind of how we're looking at evaluation, resources is always a huge issue. And so I do think that that's something, you know, I'm really interested in hearing more about, is how can you, when you're having to kind of shift the evaluation questions, you're having to reprioritize based upon what what input you got from the last evaluation, or even maybe not through a formalized evaluation, through conversations that people are having and new questions are coming up, and you want to integrate that into a more structured line of inquiry, where you're maybe gathering some data around it. How can you kind of adjust those resources in the background so that you're not, I don't know, like, I don't know how to put this, but like overspending or putting too much, putting more priority on the evaluation than the project itself? Or, you know, I think that's a really important point. The idea, I think, is not to create a situation that's overwhelming or taking up too many resources. So I do think it's something that needs to be thought through with dynamic evaluation, for sure. The other thing I wanted to raise is, you know, in kind of going back to Blanca's comment about like a culture of learning, right? And creating like this organizational learning culture, is thinking through what the role of the funder is in this, right? And in creating this kind of environment. And I'm curious how IDRC or other funders can help to kind of stimulate this type of environment through their terms of reference or other things.
Yes, thank you. I think you raised 2 points, but the second one, I think it was coming. I thought it was coming in your last comment, but it's we talked about it last time, right? So, what is the role of a funder like IDRC when you think that the scaling process itself is long, you know, can be a long-term effort? It's uncertain, right? You don't know how long this is going to last. And we've also talked about in the previous Fishbowl, we talked about the role of different actors, you know, whether it's the government or foundations, you know, bilaterals, you know, local research funding, the national funds, for example. So they might not participate at every stage of the, you know, of the innovation to scale to impact process. They might have bits along the way. And so the challenge is, you know, if you need to have a dynamic evaluation throughout, then is it possible for a funder to play that role throughout, as long as it takes? Or does it mean that everybody who funds needs to adopt the same approach at every stage, so that there's some continuity between the funding in a way? So that's an interesting, I think, challenge as well. And Blanca talked about rhythms and spaces. You know, I think you referred to that, Blanca. At least that can be created, but then at each rhythm, at each space, you know, at each moment, we might need different skills, methods, resources, etc. So anyway, a complicated thought. I agree with you, Tobias. It's a difficult issue to grasp. Yeah, and I like evaluation, but I find it difficult to grasp. Louise?
Yeah, thanks, Kike. So I'm really enjoying listening to this conversation because it resonates a lot with me as a research communicator about a lot of discussions that we've had around balancing resources. And as Blanca said, I think a lot of this is about building culture around the importance of integrating these approaches throughout a project, but also, you know, not just always bringing in external evaluators, but also it becoming a little bit of like building up the skills of everyone within the project to think about these things. But I also wanted to challenge a little bit. Leslie, you said, you know, we want to be careful that we don't take over, you know, do more evaluating than we do implementing. And I think that's absolutely right. And I've worked on communications and a lot of evaluations, and I can see how there's just so many things you want to know answers to, and it can really take over if you don't prioritize and, you know, narrow in your focus. But equally, I do think that, you know, that maybe we do need to just be giving much more space to it within projects and not seeing it as implementation versus evaluation and resources, one taking away from the other, but about, thinking, well, what is the right proportion of resources? If you have a budget, we find this in communications all the time, comms resources are seen as taking away from research budget, whereas actually if we want impact, they're both as equally valuable. So thinking about that kind of reproportioning of resources, I think is a really interesting point, and how much is an appropriate amount for monitoring and evaluation and learning in a scaling project. So, good conversation. And also, Tobias, I think really great that you brought up that how different is this actually to monitoring, evaluation and learning in a project. And I think we've talked about this and we've kind of covered this, but I think you're right. I don't think it is different. But again, it's about, for scaling, it needs to be there, integrated, and it needs to specifically be looking at those other principles. So part of that monitoring, evaluation and learning process that would happen in any project needs to be thinking about justification for scaling, optimal scale, coordination. I think that's it.
Thank you. Tatiana, I think you want to respond to that, maybe?
More or less, it's more like a comment. No, it's related to a question that you raised like a couple of minutes ago, Kike, and is what IDRC can do, etc., related to this. And something that I really like about IDRC is that it doesn't focus only on impact evaluation. And something that I really, really appreciate is that I see us, and the way we have been able to work with our focal point is that she is very flexible, and I believe is IDRC's organizational culture. And we have been thinking a lot about innovation and to do different type of evaluations and how we can remain flexible and how we can bring together the quantitative and the qualitative work. So we are working in partnerships with different institutions such as McGill University and other researchers in order to find different and new methodologies that are more flexible, and is something that I believe IDRC should continue doing, because in my experience is the most flexible like funding partner. And I see IDRC as a partner because like the way we build the evaluations that we have in the project allows us to learn and even test things that could be used by other organizations. So I believe this is something that IDRC can continue doing, and in our case, it's something that we highly appreciate.
Thank you, Tatiana. I think you made a point that Haley, you've raised in the chat. So you talk about the fact that so the funder has to be, IDRC is quite flexible about its approach to evaluation. But you raised another issue, which is that evaluation can happen through several projects, right? And if you go back to the cooperation discussion, it can happen through projects that we say we do not control, right? It might happen because of the interventions of somebody else, some other projects. And so if you're going to really evaluate or assess the whole evaluation experience, then you might have to assess, how things happen, what happened somewhere else, in a project that IDRC is just not funding or is not even involved in, but that has the potential of, enabling or derailing the scaling effort. And that's another level of flexibility, right? It's about commissioning an evaluation for something you're not involved in or remotely involved in. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Haley, or comment on, add to your comment, and then I'll go to Tobias.
Yeah, just thinking about this idea of scaling happening over a series of projects as well, I think, and this issue that's come up about how is this really different from M&E and any other project. I think sometimes as we go through a series of projects and move towards a more explicit scaling intention, or maybe that's when this starts to take more of a specific stance or a specific look. Maybe you can integrate it more when you have like set out at the beginning of a project at a certain point, once you've done some of that earlier work. Maybe you can build it more into the research. At least I think that's how we were thinking about it in the scaling playbook, for example, is when you get to a certain point where you're really doing like a scaling science, scaling research project, you're actually, the line between the evaluation and the research project might be quite blurred, and maybe that's okay. It's really about making sure that you're collecting the right evidence at that point to be able to do effective coordination, identify optimal scale, etc. And maybe earlier on in the scaling process in an earlier project, it might not be until the final evaluation that you think, okay, now we're thinking more about scaling questions. Do we just incorporate questions about scaling into a final evaluation, being explicit about looking at what we might be able to say of optimal scale in this case, or what we should be doing next. So I think there is a whole, it's maybe not very helpful in making this more concrete, but I think it can be a whole range of things, dynamic evaluation, depending on where you're at in that process.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Tobias?
So that's great. I'm so glad I joined today, because I mean, I leave a 1 hour meeting like more knowledgeable than than I entered it, and that's not always the case. But there is a concern. I think it builds up on what several people have brought up here, including you, Enrique. So to some extent, I almost feel it's kind of prescribed flexibility that we are talking about. So, which is a kind of an interesting concept, and I'm willing to subscribe to it, I guess, because of everything that we have been discussing here. But there is the issue, obviously, of compatibility with how other funding partners do things, and to what extent this is different. And I think this is a point that Enrique raised a little bit earlier, but in a more linear kind of a way, and that it is like IDRC now, and then it might be another funder later, and how do you actually then continue with what you've started then with in the context of another funder, or the other way around, obviously. But I think more complex, perhaps even, and more concerning to me, because this is what we are doing for sustainability reasons, is that we are combining different funding partners for one project at the same time. And one of the things that we are always trying to do for no other reason than efficiency is to try to not having to redo everything, but to basically do the same thing and then satisfy the requirements of various funders. Like a tech report doesn't need to be written for the one funder and the other. The best thing is you write one and then you can send it to both, and they are both happy with that. So kind of align the systems up front. And I wonder to what extent there is at least an issue in that context, that you're then having two main funders, and they follow in this context approaches that are at least partially incompatible with one another. That makes sense.
Does anybody have the similar challenge or face similar situation?
Don't want to kill the conversation.
Yeah, no. I did by asking. No, we are getting closer to the time, but many things have come up. So we started with I think a challenge to the accepting we're challenged by the principle. Discussion on the concept of dynamic evaluation. Dynamic is clearly changing, and it's I think best illustrated by the fact that we recognize that it might require different methods and different skills along the way, and different ways of managing those evaluations. It makes it a bit more complicated by the fact that it's not a single project we're evaluating, but multiple projects, sometimes working in parallel, not in a non-linear way, and projects or interventions that one single actor might not have control over. Added to that, each project might actually be supported by multiple sources of funding and interest that may require different levels of accountability and learning from those involved. That rather than thinking about a specific approach, we need to think about incorporating or embedding a culture of evaluation, maybe a culture of critical thinking, a culture of learning throughout the organizations and the people involved, rather than keeping this as a separate thing, which would be a a very expensive thing, right? Very expensive initiative of its own. What else? Any other things that the role of funders? You know, what is the role of a funder throughout the unexpected lifetime of a project? Amede, you were talking about, you know, evaluation at the level of the innovation itself. You know, that has certain rules and requires certain commitments. And then evaluation at the point of impact, that also has certain rules and requires certain commitments. And somewhere in the middle, there's a lot of things that could happen, and then funders if funders can stay with the intervention throughout, great, but they most likely won't be able to, and they'll have to pick the moment that they choose to evaluate or to assess. I don't know if there are any, yes, Johannes, any more reflections on this? You're muted, I think.
Mute myself here,
Yes.
good. So early on, somebody mentioned this possible tension between learning and accountability function of evaluation. And I must say, having been in the business of being evaluated for accountability purposes in my previous job at the World Bank as an operational manager and team leader, I've come to the conclusion that evaluation for accountability purposes, while necessary, basically means that we stop learning, because all we're trying to do as managers, when we're being evaluated for accountability purposes, to try to defend what we're doing. And rightly so, I think, up to a point. And the learning process and purpose of evaluation basically goes out the window. So I think when we talk about evaluation, it's very important to be clear what is the purpose of evaluation. Is it for accountability? In many cases, of course, donors, funders are required to use evaluation for accountability purposes. But let's be clear, when you get into that accountability mode, you lose a lot of the learning potential of evaluations. And so I think it'd be very helpful as we talk about evaluation and when and what to do, that we try to separate evaluations for accountability purposes from evaluations for learning. That may not always be possible in practice, but I think the more we can separate, the better, because otherwise I think learning will very quickly disappear from the scene. And it's, as you said earlier, Enrique, it's actually the critical aspect of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Johannes. Leslie, do you want to reflect on some of the discussion, maybe in reference to what IDRC can do looking forward?
Sure. Well, I mean, thanks for your observations and your insights. And I think this has been a really rich conversation. As someone who thinks about evaluation a lot, maybe way too much. This has been really a great conversation. I mean, one of the things, I think a few things really resonate with me and are kind of top of mind after the conversation. I think Johannes's comment about dynamic evaluation really pushing this how or why versus the what is really a really important idea, right? That there's this learning that's occurring about enabling conditions, right, for the scaling effort. And so because of that, there always needs to be this constant or continuous means of kind of reassessing and thinking about, well, what do we need to learn about next, right? I think that's an important thing to kind of have top of mind. I think the other point, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who raised it, but this idea that there's an assumption that the effects will be visible right away. This is a really, really important thing for, I think, all of us to be thinking about, especially in a dynamic evaluation context, right? Is thinking about what's the lag time between an activity that we put into place or an action that we take or some sort of effort and what we expect to see, right? And how does that change over time, or does it and we tend to think about this with outcome types of evaluations, lag time. But I think once you start thinking about this continuous cycle, could get even a little more tricky, right? So something for, I think, all of us to kind of continue to consider. Kike, to your point, to bring back up the idea of fostering this kind of a organizational culture of learning, you know, I think this is it's not really mentioned with respect to dynamic evaluation in the chapter on it. And I think that's something that we need to think about more, and how to integrate that more into the conversation of dynamic evaluation. There's this idea in the broader evaluation field of evaluative thinking, and helping people to kind of continuously question assumptions that are part of our programming, right? And so I think part of this dynamic aspect of it is also is changing that thinking, right? And helping people to do that continuous question asking about what's happening, what's working, what's not working, and what questions do we have today or a month from now or a year from now. And then finally, I've been trying to think about a different term than dynamic. And you know, some things that have come to mind that maybe represent some of this conversation is integration, right? The integration of the evaluation function, I think maybe is helpful in dynamic evaluation. And then responsive. It seems that what we're really talking about here is being responsive, right? That as we learn something more about optimal scale, as Johannes pointed out earlier, that we then kind of adapt what we're thinking about in terms of the next questions that come up. So, and that process is continuous in nature. So those are just some thoughts that have come to mind throughout the conversations, and I'm sure many others will be stimulated as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Mindful of trying to leave these fishbowls on a high, so before we all go silent. But does anybody else have any final thoughts, reflection you'd like to raise? Remember, the next round is we have a kind of a week off. We'll be sharing some of these reflections with you on Slack, and then we're going to meet again for kind of a final advisory session where IDRC will put forward a few remaining questions, and we will invite some of you and all of you really to join in and offer some additional answers. But otherwise, I'm happy to say I think we've had a good conversation. We've took an idea that was still unclear to some and push it forward. Blanca, do you have a final reflection?
Yes, just a quick comment about something I think we didn't touch in the conversation today.
Right.
I left a comment in Slack, and it's about more the political aspects of the challenges about evaluation. I have been dealing recently with discussions about conflictive environments, and sometimes, I mean, it's important to consider also that aspect when you are communicating, about your expectations. What are you going to get back from the process of evaluating or learning, and especially in the communication of the results and the recommendations to scale up or not. You need to have a good mapping of your stakeholders and know how they're going to react, if they're going to be neutral to that, if they're going to really embrace the results and move forward, or if you're going to get reactions. And in conflict contexts, especially in environmental issues that I have been recently involved with, that puts a lot of noise, so to speak, but you need to be aware of that, not be naive about the political context.
Yeah, exactly. That was very useful, very important. And Johannes is inviting everybody to join this Scaling Up community of practice. So if anybody would like to join, he sent us an invitation there, continue this conversation with a broader group of scaling, is it a scaling entrepreneurs, scalers, scaling experts. All right, so we can bring this conversation to a close. Thank you, Blanca, for not letting us forget about the political dimension of everything we're doing. I had a conversation with the UK Evaluation Society last week about this, about the politics of evaluation, and recognizing that the act of evaluation is a political act. You know, the results can actually have, you know, consequences in the political space, especially if you're talking about scaling an intervention that, you know, government might be interested in, politically speaking, as well as technically. So all of these things are worth considering. And maybe we can continue this conversation about the politics of the dynamic evaluation on the Slack channel over the next few days. So let's continue the conversation with those who were not able to join us. And as I said, in a couple of weeks, we'll have our final Fishbowl, which will be more of a panel discussion, and I'll send you an email and a Slack message explaining how that session is going to go. So we'll be sharing the video later today, and I look forward to continuing this conversation on Slack. Thank you, Leslie, and Tobias, and everybody else, Blanca, and those who participated for your interventions. Yes. Nice to see you all. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.